Hello, my friends. Welcome. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions really help the channel grow. I never believed in winter being dangerous. I'd always thought it was beautiful. Crisp air, sparkling snow, the quiet that made everything feel suspended in time. That was before last December, before I learned that winter could hide something ancient and patient, something that waited for the isolated, the careless, the alone. I took the caretaker job at an old hunting cabin in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for the winter, thinking it would be a quiet escape from my city life. The owners were an older couple from Boston who came up only during the hunting season, leaving me to handle the place during the off months. The cabin was remote, miles from the nearest town, nestled in a valley with thick woods on all sides. No cell service, no neighbors close enough to see you, and a snow-covered road that would be impassable by the end of November. The first days were peaceful. I settled into a routine: firewood in the morning, checking the propane and heating systems, cleaning and walking the property. The snow was already thick on the ground when I arrived, and the mountains loomed over the clearing like silent guardians. But even then, there was a feeling in the air I couldn't describe. A tension in the trees, a weight in the sky. It felt like the place was waiting for something. The first sign that something was wrong came on the third night. I woke around midnight, too warm from the fire and sweating under my blankets. I saw it in the moonlight filtering through the frost on the window, a shadow, standing just at the tree line, taller than any human should be, motionless. I froze. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but it was there. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks because of the isolation. The next morning, I noticed strange tracks in the snow. They were long and wide, almost humanoid, but the proportions were wrong, the heels too narrow, the toes unnaturally long. They led from the woods directly to the cabin's back porch and stopped abruptly. No continuation, no footprints going away, just stopping. I took photos and chalked it up to a prank, though who could have traveled miles of snow silently to do this? The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. Over the following days, the cabin began to feel smaller, constricting, suffocating. I would move from room to room, and for a brief moment, it would feel like someone else had been there before me. Objects were slightly out of place. Tools I had left on counters would appear on the floor, chairs slightly turned. I convinced myself I was just being careless, sleep-deprived. By the 5th night, the snowstorm hit. The wind howled against the cabin, shaking the windows and rattling the shutters. I stayed close to the fireplace, trying to keep calm. That night, I woke again, this time to footprints inside the cabin. Slushy, wet prints leading from the kitchen to the hallway, then vanishing halfway to the bedroom. I know I hadn't left the front door unlocked, and no window was open. Panic set in. I spent the rest of the night in the bedroom, huddled against the wall, flashlight in hand. The next morning, I saw the tracks outside had multiplied. More elongated prints forming loops around the cabin, sometimes crossing over themselves. They never led away. They only encircled the building as if something had been pacing, studying me. I tried to leave, tried to drive down the mountain road, but the snow was impassable. The truck wouldn't start. The battery was frozen, cracked. It was as if the mountain itself had trapped me. Days passed. I barely slept. Shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. At night, I could feel the presence just outside the cabin, waiting, pacing, patient. I began talking aloud, telling whoever or whatever it was to leave me alone. That didn't work. I felt it learn, respond, adapt. I could see the change in the snow outside, the tracks shifting in new, strange patterns. One evening, I decided to make my way to the woods. I needed to see whatever it was, to confront it. I wrapped myself in every layer I had and stepped out into the freezing wind. The snow crunched under my boots as I followed the tracks. They led deeper than I expected, into the thick forest. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness between the trees, tall, thin, featureless. No face, no discernible form, only outlines swaying slightly. They didn't move like humans, but they moved with purpose, watching. I stumbled back, terrified, and the figures didn't follow. They just stood, silent, observing. When I turned to run, I realized the path back was gone. The snow behind me was pristine, no footprints, as if I had never left the cabin at all. Fear gnawed at me, a raw, physical thing. I ran blindly through the woods, slipping and falling until I somehow made it back to the cabin. That night, I barricaded every door and window, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Around midnight, I thought I heard something breathing. I know it sounds absurd, but it was slow, deliberate, like air moving through an enormous chest. I stayed in the corner of the living room, holding a fireplace poker, staring at the windows. Nothing happened. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense that it was moving just beyond the frost, circling the cabin, waiting. By the 12th day, I realized I wasn't alone. I had been ignoring the signs, rationalizing them, but I could no longer deny it. Something was in the snow with me, something ancient, something patient. The tracks outside formed patterns now, deliberate spirals, circles, shapes I couldn't identify, as if trying to communicate something beyond language. Every night, I saw the shadows at the edge of the tree line, always the same, swaying slightly, always watching. Finally, I decided I had to leave. I packed my things and tried the truck again. Miraculously, it started, and I drove down the mountain road, terrified and exhausted. But even as I left, I could feel it in the rearview mirror, the presence of the forest pressing down, watching. When I reached the main road, I stopped for gas and tried to explain to the clerk what had happened. She didn't react, just gave me a blank stare and said, "You're lucky to have gotten out." I never went back. I don't even drive near that mountain range anymore. But sometimes, when I see snow falling, I remember the shapes in the tree line, the tracks circling the cabin, the cold presence that waited for me in the shadows. I know it still waits. It doesn't need me to return. It only needs the cold and the isolation, and it will find someone else. Every winter, I dream of those tracks stretching endlessly into the forest, and I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that the quiet outside my window is more than just the wind. Because I know, in some way I can't understand, that it never sleeps. It waits in the snow, patient, unrelenting, and when it finds someone alone, it doesn't let them go. I tell myself I was lucky. I tell myself it couldn't follow me out of the mountains, but deep down, I know the truth. Some things in the winter do not stay hidden. They do not die. They wait for the cold, the snow, the silence, and the people foolish enough to wander into it. I have never felt safe in winter since. I don't travel north in December. I don't hike in the snow. I don't even look out my window when the wind whistles in the night, because I know if I do, I will see the shapes again, the figures, watching, waiting, patient, and someday, if I am careless, they will find me. I didn't plan to spend the winter alone in Maine. I'm not the kind of person who seeks isolation. I thrive in crowded spaces with lights and laughter all around. But after my last relationship ended abruptly, I wanted nothing more than to disappear for a few months, and that's how I ended up accepting the caretaker job at an old family lodge deep in the woods near Baxter State Park. It was meant to be temporary, but the experience became something I'll never forget, and something I can't explain. The lodge itself was beautiful in a way that felt untouched by time. Built in the 1920s, it had thick wooden beams, a massive stone fireplace, and a view of the surrounding pines and mountains that was breathtaking. But the beauty was deceptive. It felt off somehow. The locals had told me stories when I asked about the property. Stories about strange noises in the winter, missing travelers, and lights in the woods that shouldn't have existed. I laughed it off. People love their ghost stories in Maine. It's a selling point for tourism. I arrived in early December, and the first few days were calm. I walked the trails behind the lodge, cleared snow from the driveway, and familiarized myself with the old heating system. Nights were quiet, and the silence was almost intoxicating. But that silence changed, and I would have given anything to go back to it. It began with the snow. One morning, I found odd tracks leading from the tree line to the lodge. They weren't like the tracks of deer or foxes. They were long, wide, almost human in shape. But something was wrong. The toes were too long, the heels too narrow, and the prints were spaced too far apart for a normal person. They stopped abruptly at the porch steps with no sign of departure. I photographed them and shook my head, telling myself a hiker must have passed by. That seemed reasonable. That first night, I noticed something strange in the fireplace reflection. At first, I thought it was just the shadows of the logs, but there was something more. A figure. It appeared in the doorway behind me for a split second. When I turned around, nothing was there. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, or maybe a trick of the light. By the fourth day, the cold had intensified. The snowstorm that arrived was relentless, burying the lodge under several feet of snow. I stayed inside, rationing supplies and trying to keep the fire going. That evening, I noticed the kitchen door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. I closed it, double-checked the locks, and brushed it off as fatigue. But the next morning, the door was open again. I began seeing shadows at the edge of my vision. In the mornings, I would wake to find footprints in the snow that hadn't been there before. The strange, elongated ones. They always ended at the lodge, never leading away. I started locking all the doors and windows, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever, or whoever, was out there didn't follow normal rules. By the seventh day, sleep became impossible. I would doze for a few minutes, only to wake in a cold sweat, certain I had seen someone standing at the window. I even began hearing whispers, faint, unintelligible, coming from the woods. I would rush to the windows to look, but there was nothing, only the snow-covered trees and the frozen ground. I realized the lodge itself felt different at night. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows stretched in unnatural ways, and even the firelight seemed weak, as though something was draining the warmth from the room. I found myself talking aloud, telling whatever was out there that I wasn't afraid, hoping that by acknowledging it, I could keep it at bay. It didn't respond. Then it got worse. I'd been up late one night checking the windows again when I noticed footprints inside the lodge, muddy, slushy prints leading from the back hallway to the living room, and then vanishing. No one could have come inside without opening a door, and all the doors were locked. I began to panic. My phone had no signal, the landline was dead, and the satellite connection was intermittent. I was alone, completely isolated. A week passed with no sign of life except for the tracks and shadows. I convinced myself to take a walk outside, thinking I needed fresh air. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind cut through my jacket like a knife. I followed a faint path behind the lodge and found more of the elongated footprints. They didn't stop at the tree line this time. They continued into the forest, deeper than I dared to follow. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was walking through the forest behind the lodge. The snow was deep up to my waist. I couldn't move quickly. The tracks I had been following appeared all around me, circling inwards. I tried to call out, but no sound came. Then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, tall, thin, featureless. They didn't move like humans. They didn't speak. They just stared. And then, in unison, they began to approach. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The following day, I resolved to leave. I packed essentials into my truck, trying to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I tried again, still nothing. I cursed the old vehicle and attempted to start the generator, but even that failed. It was as if the cold had come alive, feeding on my fear, locking me in place. That evening, I stayed inside, barricading doors and windows as best I could. I heard movement outside, near the lodge, something pacing, circling. I dared not look, but I could feel its presence, patient and watchful. I noticed shadows through the frost of the windows, stretching unnaturally long, like limbs twisting toward the lodge. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt broken. At some point, I heard the door to the main hall creak open. I wasn't sure if I had slept or if it had opened itself. I found the living room empty, but then I noticed muddy footprints on the floor, leading toward the staircase and disappearing halfway up. I stared at them, frozen until the sun began to rise. By morning, I managed to get the truck started and drove down the winding mountain road, the lodge shrinking in the rearview mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every curve, every tree, seemed like it could conceal those tall, thin figures. Weeks later, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the lodge, taken from the edge of the clearing at night. The windows glowed faintly, and in the snow outside I could just make out the figures, tall, featureless, standing perfectly still, watching. Below the photo, scrawled in jagged black ink, were the words, "You left, but we stayed." I never returned to the lodge. I moved south to warmer states, surrounded myself with lights and people. But every winter, when the nights grow long and the cold wind bites at my skin, I feel them again, watching, patient, waiting. I don't know what they are, and I don't want to. All I know is that some things in the winter never leave. They wait in the snow beyond the trees, and if you ever wander into their territory, they will find you. And unlike the snow, they don't melt. I never thought I would spend an entire winter alone in the mountains. I had taken the job as caretaker for a small resort in northern New Hampshire, thinking it would be peaceful, quiet, uneventful, a chance to get away from the city and focus on writing. The resort was closed for the season, and my only responsibility was to keep the place maintained and make sure the boilers didn't freeze. It seemed simple enough. The first few days were routine. I woke early, checked the boiler, shoveled the snow off the walkways, and walked the property to make sure no wildlife had wandered into the buildings. The mountain air was crisp, the snow untouched, sparkling in the weak winter sun. The silence was profound, almost reverent. I enjoyed it, at least until the fourth day. That morning, I went to clear the snow from the lodge's front entrance. I noticed strange footprints in the powder, leading from the tree line to the front porch. They weren't human. They were elongated, with strange indentations in the heel, almost like claws. But they stopped abruptly at the porch steps. No return trail, no continuation into the woods. I felt a shiver run through me. I convinced myself it was a fox or some other animal, even though the tracks didn't match anything I knew. That night the temperature dropped dramatically, and the wind howled against the mountainside, shaking the windows. I stayed inside, reading and trying to ignore the eerie feeling settling in my chest. Around midnight, I noticed something strange, a reflection in the window that didn't match the room. A dark figure standing behind me in the kitchen doorway, though the room was empty. I spun around. Nothing. I told myself it was a trick of the shadows, exhaustion, or too much coffee. The next day, I explored the resort grounds further. I followed the strange footprints into the forest. The snow deepened and the trees grew thicker, their branches bending under the weight. I found more of the tracks circling the perimeter of the lodge. The pattern was deliberate, almost ritualistic. It made me uneasy, but curiosity pushed me further. On the sixth day, I noticed something I couldn't explain. The snow around the lodge had depressions, shallow pits arranged in a circle, as if something, or someone, had been digging. I hadn't seen anyone. There were no other tracks leading away from the lodge, and yet the pits had appeared overnight. I tried to rationalize it. Animals? Snow shifting? But the formation was too precise, too symmetrical. That evening, I decided to stay awake. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the wind, staring out the frost-covered windows. Around 11:30 p.m., I saw movement in the tree line, a shadow gliding between the trunks, fast and silent. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, shining the beam into the dark forest. Nothing, but the footprints I had followed earlier had returned, leading from the trees to the lodge, stopping at the front door. I began locking all doors and windows and refused to leave the main lodge building. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the shadows outside seemed to grow bolder. I thought about leaving immediately, but the nearest town was over 30 miles away, and the roads were treacherous with fresh snow. I had no choice but to stay. The nights became unbearable. I started noticing things moving inside the lodge, small, almost imperceptible shifts. Chairs slightly turned, tools on counters rearranged, doors ajar that I was certain I had locked. One night, I awoke to find a single muddy boot print at the foot of my bed, facing the door. My heart raced. I had been alone. There was no logical explanation. I tried to reach someone by phone. No signal. I tried my satellite phone. Dead. It was as if the winter itself had cut me off from the world. I began recording notes about what I was seeing, hoping to make sense of it later. But the more I wrote, the more anxious I became. On the 9th night, the strangest thing happened. I woke to the feeling of breath on my neck, though I was under thick blankets, in a locked room, and completely alone. I sat up abruptly and saw the frost-covered window slowly streaking, as if someone, or something, was pressing its hand against the glass from the outside. I didn't run. I couldn't. I was frozen with fear. The next morning, the snow outside had strange formations, trails leading from the tree line to the lodge, spiraling around the perimeter, like something had been pacing all night. And in the center of the clearing, deep depressions in the snow, arranged like a circle, perfectly symmetrical. I didn't recognize what they were or what had made them, but I felt the undeniable weight of a presence. I stayed inside for the next 2 days, refusing to look outside. But on the 12th day, curiosity overpowered fear. I peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, I noticed the shadows at the edge of the tree line. They were tall, thin, swaying slightly. They didn't move like animals. They didn't move like humans. They just watched. I began seeing them everywhere. At first, in reflections, faintly in the mirrors, then in the corner of my vision while I walked the lodge. They were always at the edge, always just out of reach. They never attacked, never made a sound, but their presence was oppressive, suffocating. On the 14th night, I heard a knock at the front door. I froze. No one could have come through the deep snow unnoticed. Another knock. I grabbed a hammer for protection and slowly approached. I peered through the peephole. Nothing. But the snow on the porch had changed. There were footprints, tall and thin, leading away into the forest, vanishing before they reached the tree line. I stayed awake the entire night after that. I didn't close my eyes. I couldn't. Shadows moved across the walls, even with all the lights on. The wind carried shapes, almost human, almost impossible. I began talking to them, aloud, demanding they leave. Of course, they didn't respond. On the 16th day, the snow stopped. The sky was clear for the first time in over a week. I decided to leave immediately, packing everything into my truck. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I looked around for help, but the mountain was silent, empty. The trees stood like dark sentinels, watching. I walked back toward the lodge, thinking maybe I could find a phone or a signal. That's when I saw them. The figures. Dozens of them, emerging from the tree line. Tall, thin, featureless, swaying slightly. They moved silently, gliding over the snow. They surrounded the lodge, never touching the building, never making a sound. But their presence was overwhelming, pressing into my chest, into my mind, filling me with a despair I couldn't explain. I ran inside, locking every door and window. I didn't sleep that night, though I tried. I could see them through the frost on the glass, standing outside, endlessly patient. When dawn came, they were gone. But the tracks they left remained, and I knew they hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, somewhere beyond the trees, watching, knowing I'd been afraid. I managed to get the truck started eventually, the battery somehow working, and drove down the mountain as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I told myself it was over, that I had imagined the figures, the tracks, the shadows, but I didn't feel free. The sensation of being watched lingered for weeks afterward, like a phantom cold pressing against my skin. Months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was the lodge, taken at night from the edge of the clearing. The lights were dim inside, the windows frosted, and at the edge of the snow, barely visible in the darkness, were the figures. Tall, thin, featureless, standing silently, watching. At the bottom of the photograph, written in black ink, were the words, "We are still here." I never return to the mountains. I avoid snow, avoid isolation. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind blows cold against my window, I swear I can see shadows moving just beyond the tree line. And I know they're waiting, watching, patient. And I know without a doubt that if I ever set foot in those mountains again during winter, I will not leave. Because some things that dwell in the snow are patient, they are endless, and they do not forgive. I never believed in haunted places or ghost stories. I like to think I was practical, rational, grounded in the real world. That all changed during the winter I spent alone in the mountains of Vermont, a winter that still haunts me every time I feel the cold wind against my face. I had been offered a short-term job taking care of a remote hunting lodge, mostly empty except for maintenance and seasonal guests. The pay was good, the isolation appealing, and I told myself it would be a chance to recharge away from the city. I didn't think twice about the warnings the locals gave. Winter comes early up there, they said, and sometimes it never really leaves. I smiled, nodded, and told myself they were just exaggerating. The lodge was a 2-story wooden structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forests. The first night, the snow fell heavily. By morning, the world outside was transformed into a white expanse. I unpacked my few belongings and prepared for a week of solitude. The fireplace in the main room worked perfectly, and I was confident I could survive the cold as long as I kept the wood stacked. The first few days were peaceful. I went on walks, surveyed the forest, and made sure the lodge was in order. But there was a feeling I couldn't shake. The kind of sensation that makes your skin crawl without any obvious cause. I attributed it to being alone, to the wind moaning through the trees, to the way shadows stretched unnaturally over the snow. But something didn't feel right. It started on the third night. I woke to a soft tapping sound at the front door. At first I thought it was the wind or a branch brushing against the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound came again. 3 deliberate taps, spaced evenly. I approached the door cautiously, peered through the small window. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the presence of someone or something watching. The next morning, the snow outside was unusual. There were tracks leading from the forest to the lodge, but they weren't human. They were tall, wide, and oddly symmetrical, like nothing I had seen before. They disappeared abruptly a few feet from the cabin, as if whoever or whatever was walking had vanished into thin air. I told myself it was probably some kind of animal, a deer, or maybe a large dog. But the tracks didn't match anything I recognized, and the feeling of being watched didn't let up. By the 5th day, the wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped drastically. I stayed inside, stacking wood and trying to keep the lodge warm. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I noticed something odd on the window. Handprints. Clear, defined handprints pressed against the glass. I knew I hadn't touched the windows. They were all locked from the inside. I stepped back, heart racing. There was no way anyone could have reached the windows without leaving footprints in the snow. And yet, the prints were there, smeared as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass and tried to see inside. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a visitor had arrived while I was out. But the snow was untouched, save for the tracks I had seen earlier. There was no path to the window, no footprints, nothing. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was walking through the forest, snow up to my knees. The trees loomed over me, their branches heavy with ice. I felt eyes on me, countless eyes, watching from the shadows. I tried to run, but my legs were heavy, as if the snow itself was holding me down. I looked down and saw footprints in the snow, not my own, but taller, darker, moving in the opposite direction. They followed me everywhere I went. I woke up in a sweat, convinced the dream had been a warning. But as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The soft tapping, this time at the window of my bedroom. I didn't move. The taps continued for several minutes, rhythmic and deliberate. Then they stopped. The next day, I found the snow around the lodge disturbed again. The strange tracks circled the building, stopping at the front door, then continuing into the forest. It was as if someone had been walking around the lodge for hours, invisible, leaving no evidence except the tracks. By the end of the week, I was on edge. I began noticing small things. Objects slightly moved, footprints inside the lodge I couldn't explain, the feeling of breath on my neck when no one was there. I stopped sleeping properly, fearing what I would find if I closed my eyes. On the 8th night, the storm hit. Snow blew in thick sheets and the wind howled like it had a life of its own. I tried to stay calm, but the temperature inside the lodge dropped despite the fire. I heard the tapping again at the front door, then at the back, then along the sides. It moved around the building as if circling me, studying me. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to confront whatever was there. The snow was deep, the wind cutting through my coat. I shone the light across the clearing and the forest beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, hunched over, watching me. Then it vanished. I ran back inside, locking all doors and windows. I stayed awake all night, holding the flashlight, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, the snowstorm had passed. I stepped outside, trying to see any evidence of what had been there. But the clearing was pristine, untouched, except for the strange tracks leading from the forest to the lodge. They stopped again at the edge of the snow. I packed my bags immediately. I couldn't wait to leave. I drove the winding mountain roads back to the main highway, checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see that figure following me. I told myself it was over. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a combination of isolation, cold, and stress. But it wasn't over. Weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph of the lodge. The picture was taken at night. I could see the windows, faintly lit by the fire inside. And outside, standing in the snow, was a figure. Tall, thin, featureless, watching the building. I didn't recognize it at first until I noticed its posture. It was hunched, like it was studying something. Studying me. The bottom of the photograph had a single line written in crude black ink. You left, but I stayed. I called the authorities, thinking it was a prank, but the postmark indicated it came from the town near the lodge. The officer I spoke to gave me a blank stare and said, "You're not the first person to get something like that from that area." He refused to elaborate. I never went back to the lodge. I never took another winter job in isolation. But I still think about it, especially when I see snow falling heavily, when the wind carries that unnatural chill. I think about the tracks, the handprints, the figure that disappeared into the forest, but somehow never left. I've moved to a warmer state now. I try to forget. But every winter, when the nights grow long and the cold seeps in, I feel it. Watching. Waiting. Just beyond the tree line, where the snow glistens like glass. And I know, without a doubt, that it's still out there. because some things that dwell in the winter don't leave when the snow melts. They don't go away when you drive far enough from the mountains. They wait, they watch, and when the time is right, they come for you. I never liked winter. People talk about the beauty of fresh snow, the calmness, the stillness, how it makes the world quiet, pure, clean. But I grew up in northern Minnesota, where winter wasn't a postcard. It was a test of whether your car would start, whether you'd slip on black ice, whether your pipes would freeze overnight. It was survival, plain and simple. But nothing in 34 years of living prepared me for the deadliest winter I'd ever encounter. The winter I still dream about. The winter I still hear. It started the week I moved into my uncle's old cabin near the Canadian border. He'd passed away in October, and since I worked remotely and had nowhere particular to be, I volunteered to spend the winter cleaning the place up and preparing it for sale. Property values were rising. My aunt wanted to get rid of the memories. Fair enough. The cabin wasn't huge. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, creaking floors, a wood stove, and a wraparound porch buried under years of neglect. The nearest town was 15 miles away. Nearest neighbor, 4. I wasn't bothered. Honestly, I thought the isolation would be good for me. For the first few days, it was peaceful. The kind of quiet you feel in your bones. The lake behind the cabin froze earlier than usual that year, becoming a glassy sheet stretching into the tree line, reflecting the pale winter sun. I walked on it once, tentatively, and even through my boots I felt the cold sink straight into my skin. My uncle loved that lake. He used to ice fish there, sometimes all night, bundled up in layers, a lantern glowing beside him. My aunt once told me he came back from a trip white as a sheet, muttering about voices under the ice. He eventually brushed it off as exhaustion or the wind, but the way he'd said it stuck with me. I shrugged it off. People hear strange things when they're alone in the cold. On my 3rd night, the temperature dropped fast, so fast that the windows frosted over from the inside. I threw 2 more logs into the stove and settled into the recliner with a blanket. Around midnight, I started nodding off. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Then, I heard it. A single knock on the back door. I jolted upright. No one would be out here at this hour, and definitely not in temperatures cold enough to freeze your spit before it hit the ground. I waited. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. I walked to the back door, each floorboard groaning under my feet. The small window in the door was fogged over. I wiped it with my sleeve. Nothing. Just darkness and snow drifting past like ash. I didn't open the door. Something in me refused. Something old, primal. Instead, I checked the front door. Locked, checked the windows, all sealed. I convinced myself it was a branch hitting the wood, or maybe the temperature shift pulling the walls. But the knocks kept coming. 3 slow taps spaced minutes apart. They continued until the fire burned low and the room dimmed. Only then did they stop. The next morning, I found no footprints in the snow. That should have been my sign to pack up and leave. But I was stubborn, maybe stupid. I told myself it was the cold messing with the structure, nothing more. 2 nights later, I learned it wasn't. I'd stepped outside late that afternoon to grab more firewood. The cold hit me so hard, my eyelashes stiffened. I grabbed the logs, turned to go back inside, and froze, not from the temperature, but from the drag marks. Behind the cabin, leading from the tree line toward the lake, the snow was disturbed. 2 parallel tracks, like something heavy had been pulled across the surface. The snow around them was discolored, speckled with something dark, rust-colored, blood. I crouched down. The drag marks continued several yards before they just stopped. No turn, no footprints, just an end point. And beyond that point, thin cracks in the ice, like something had gone under. I backed away, carrying the logs inside with shaking hands. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the knocks, but because there weren't any. The silence was worse. The next day, a storm rolled in. one of those brutal northern whiteouts that swallows the world whole. I couldn't see 20 feet outside. All day I sat inside, listening to the wind hammer the roof, waiting for something. I didn't know what, but I could feel it, like eyes watching through the snow. Around 8 p.m., I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, slow, crunching through snowdrifts that should have been too deep for a person to walk. They approached the front door, then the back, then the sides of the cabin, circling. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped behind the house, right where the drag marks had been. I heard something scrape against the siding, long and low. Then came a voice, a woman's voice. It whispered my name. I stood frozen in the center of the room. My breath hung in the air. There was no mistaking it. My name, spoken clearly, too close. Then again, louder. I grabbed my uncle's shotgun from above the mantel, though I doubted it would do anything against whatever this was. The voice moved around the cabin, whispering from different sides, sometimes urgent, sometimes drawn out, almost mocking. Then something hit the window. A single tap. It was enough to break me. I ran to the bedroom, slammed the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and sat against the wall with the shotgun across my lap. I stayed there until dawn. No more footsteps, no more voice. But I didn't sleep. When morning came, the storm had passed. I stepped outside carefully, shotgun in hand. There were no footprints, but the windows, every one of them, had long streaks on the outside, not scratches, wipes, as if someone had dragged their hand across the glass while peering inside. Every single window. By afternoon, I was ready to leave. I packed what I could into my truck and tried to start it. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I popped the hood and found the battery frozen solid, cracked straight through. I was stuck. I didn't go outside again that day. That night the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. I heard them in the hallway, by the stove, near the bedroom door. My uncle's name was spoken too, softly, sadly. And then another sound, the one that nearly made my heart stop. Breathing. Slow, labored breathing coming from the living room. I inched out of the bedroom, shotgun trembling in my grip. The living room was dark except for faint moonlight leaking through a crack in the frost-covered window. Something stood by the stove. A shape, just a silhouette at first, broad shoulders, arms too long, head bent at an unnatural angle. It swayed slightly like it was trying to remember how to stand. I raised the shotgun, the shadow twitched, the head snapped upright, and even in the dim light, I saw its eyes. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were empty, hollow. Like two wells cut into a face that wasn't a face at all. It took one step toward me. I fired. The blast lit the room for a split second. The shape didn't fall, it vanished. Not like something dodging or running. It simply wasn't there anymore. The room was empty, but footprints, wet, slushy footprints, appeared on the floor, starting just inches from where the thing had stood, leading toward the back door. The door swung open, though I hadn't touched it. A gust of air colder than anything I'd felt rushed inside, and from outside came a whisper, not a woman's voice this time. My uncle's. I slammed the door and bolted it. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I hid under the bed, a grown man, armed, terrified out of his mind. I heard the thing circling outside, then the scratching started, on the siding, on the windows, on the doorframe. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't exist anymore, only fear. At some point, I must have blacked out. When I woke, everything was quiet. The morning sun shone through the frosted windows. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I had hallucinated everything. Until I saw the bedroom floor. Water pooled near the doorway. Footprints, those same slushy prints, led from the hall directly to the bed. To me. And then back out again. I packed in under 10 minutes. I didn't care about the cracked battery. I ran to the truck, turned the key, and by some miracle the engine coughed to life. I drove through the snow with the door still open, not stopping until I reached town. I told people I'd had a bad scare. A wolf, maybe. Or a bear. I didn't say anything real. Who would believe me? A week later, my aunt called. She'd spoken with the coroner about my uncle's death. He hadn't died from a heart attack like we thought. He'd gone through the ice, except the lake was frozen solid that day, too thick to fall through. His body had been found half a mile from where he supposedly fell. The official explanation? He'd suffered hypothermia, wandered, become disoriented. But she told me something that made my blood run cold. There were drag marks near where they found him, just like the ones behind the cabin. She asked me if I'd noticed anything strange while I was there. I didn't tell her. I couldn't. But I did tell her to sell the cabin immediately. She agreed. It sold in June. 3 months later, I got a voicemail from the new owner. He sounded shaken, asking if anything weird ever happened in the cabin during winter. He said he'd been hearing things, knocks on the windows, whispering in the hallway, something walking on the porch at night. He said it knew his name. He asked me to call him back. I never did, because I already know what's happening to him, and I know there's nothing I can say that will save him. The thing in that winter darkness, the thing that took my uncle, the thing that followed me through the house, doesn't stop. It waits. It moves. It learns. And if you ever find yourself alone in deep winter, somewhere far from town, somewhere where the cold feels alive, if you hear your name whispered outside your door, if you see handprints streaked across your windows in the morning, don't look. Don't open the door, because once it finds you, it doesn't let go. If this story scared you, make sure you're subscribed.